My name is Diana, and I'm 34 years old. For 8 years, I thought I had the perfect marriage to Marcus. But 6 months ago, everything started feeling wrong. My younger sister Emma had just moved in after her divorce, and Marcus kept telling me I was being paranoid about the changes I noticed. He'd laugh, kiss my forehead, and assure me everything was fine. Before I share what shattered my world that night, tell me where you're watching from. If you've ever had that gut feeling something was wrong, hit subscribe and like this video, because what I discovered might save someone else's life. I met Marcus at a medical conference in Denver 9 years ago. I was a cardiac nurse passionate about my work, and he was this charming pharmaceutical sales representative who somehow made discussing drug interactions feel like poetry. He had this way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room, even when we were surrounded by hundreds of medical professionals. Our first conversation lasted 4 hours, flowing from coffee to lunch to dinner, without either of us noticing the time passing. Marcus pursued me with the kind of intensity that made me feel treasured. He'd show up at the hospital with my favorite lavender tea on particularly tough shifts. He memorized my schedule and would text encouraging messages right before I had to deal with difficult cases. When I mentioned loving hiking, he researched every trail within 100 miles and planned weekend adventures complete with packed lunches and sunrise starts. 6 months into dating, he took me to Garden of the Gods at dawn and proposed with my grandmother's ring that he'd somehow gotten from my sister Emma without me knowing. Our wedding was everything I'd dreamed of, but never thought I'd have. We married in the Colorado mountains with just 40 guests, the aspens turning gold around us like nature's own celebration. Marcus's vows made everyone cry, especially when he promised to protect me not just from the world's hardships, but from my own doubts and fears. He said I'd never have to face anything alone again, that my battles would be his battles, my dreams, his mission. Emma, my maid of honor, whispered that she'd never seen a man more in love. The first 3 years of our marriage felt like an extended honeymoon. We bought a 4-bedroom colonial in Highlands Ranch, planning to fill those extra rooms with children. Marcus would come home from sales trips with baby clothes from different cities, building a collection for our future family. Sunday mornings were sacred, spent cooking elaborate breakfasts together while planning renovations for what would become the nursery. He'd spin me around the kitchen talking about teaching our kids to ski, taking family camping trips, being the kind of father he'd never had. When conception didn't happen naturally after a year, Marcus was the one who suggested we see a specialist. He held my hand through every appointment, every blood draw, every devastating negative test. The fertility treatments were brutal, 3 rounds of IVF that drained our savings and my hope. Each failure hit me like a physical blow, but Marcus never wavered. After the 3rd failed cycle, when I sobbed that I was broken, that he should find someone who could give him children, he pulled me close and whispered that I was his family, complete and whole, with or without babies. My parents died in a car accident 5 years into our marriage, a drunk driver on Interstate 70 taking them instantly. Marcus handled everything from funeral arrangements to settling their estate, while I could barely function through the grief. He took 3 weeks off work, something his demanding sales job had never allowed before, just to make sure I ate, slept, and slowly found my way back to living. Emma was finishing law school in California then, and Marcus flew her back and forth, making sure we sisters had each other during the worst time of our lives. Emma had always been the wild child compared to my cautious nature. She was 28 to my 34, brilliant and impulsive, where I was steady and methodical. She'd married Jake right out of college, a whirlwind romance that looked passionate from the outside, but was actually volatile and destructive. Marcus never liked Jake, said something about him felt off, and tried to protect Emma without overstepping. He'd check in on her when Jake was traveling, always making sure she knew she had somewhere safe to run if needed. When Emma finally left Jake after discovering his affairs with multiple women, including her best friend, she was broken in ways I'd never seen. She called me at 2 a.m, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. Marcus didn't hesitate when I looked at him with the question in my eyes. He was already pulling on his shoes, grabbing car keys, saying we'd drive to California that night to get her. We packed up her apartment while Jake was at work, Marcus handling the heavy lifting while I held Emma as she cried. Marcus immediately offered our guest room, the one we'd stopped calling the future nursery after the failed treatments. He said family takes care of family, that Emma would stay as long as she needed to heal and rebuild. He helped her find a job at a law firm downtown, even calling in favors from connections he'd made through pharmaceutical work. Watching him care for my sister with such genuine concern made me fall in love with him all over again. He'd make her favorite foods when she had bad days, leave encouraging notes on her bathroom mirror, include her in our date nights when she seemed particularly lonely. Those first weeks with Emma living with us actually brought new energy to our home. We'd have movie nights where Marcus would make elaborate popcorn bars with different seasonings. Emma would regale us with stories from law school that had us crying with laughter. Weekend brunches became a tradition, the three of us trying new recipes and rating them on increasingly ridiculous scales Marcus invented. He taught Emma to golf, something she'd always wanted to learn, spending patient hours at the driving range fixing her swing. I was grateful to have my sister close during my own ongoing struggle with infertility grief. Emma understood loss in a different way now, and we'd take long walks in the evening talking about rebuilding lives that looked nothing like what we'd planned. Marcus would often join us, walking between us with an arm around each of our shoulders, calling us his girls and promising better days ahead. Those moments felt like healing, like maybe we were all finding our way to something new, and possibly even better than what we'd lost. The changes started so gradually that I later wondered if I'd missed earlier signs, or if Marcus and Emma had simply gotten better at hiding them as time went on. It began with Marcus's schedule shifting in ways that seemed reasonable at first. His company was launching a new drug, he explained, which meant longer hours and more client dinners. He'd always been dedicated to his work, often the top sales performer in his region, so the additional commitment didn't initially concern me. But then he joined a gym across town, despite us having a fully equipped home gym in our basement that he'd insisted on installing just 2 years earlier. When I asked about it, he said he needed to network with doctors who worked out there, that casual conversations on treadmills often led to bigger sales than formal meetings. His phone habits changed too. The man who used to leave his phone anywhere, who'd ask me to answer his texts while he drove, suddenly kept it face down during meals. He'd take calls in the garage, claiming the reception was better there, though we'd never had signal issues in our house. When notification sounds came through at odd hours, he'd quickly silence them, saying it was just work emails from different time zones. Once when his phone rang during dinner, I saw Emma's eyes flick to it, before Marcus even moved, like she knew who was calling. Emma's transformation happened in parallel, though I didn't connect it to Marcus initially. She started dressing differently, trading her post-divorce uniform of yoga pants and oversized sweaters for fitted dresses and carefully applied makeup. She said the law firm had a strict appearance code, but she'd wear these outfits on weekends too. New jewelry appeared, delicate pieces she claimed were gifts to herself for surviving the divorce, rewards for her strength. Her confidence, shattered by Jake's betrayal, rebuilt itself with surprising speed, but there was something different about it, almost secretive, like she knew something wonderful that she couldn't share. Marcus began offering to drive Emma places, always with logical reasons. Her car needed service, so he'd drop her at work. They were both going downtown anyway, might as well save gas. The law firm was hosting evening events he could network at, so picking her up made sense. These explanations were so reasonable that questioning them felt petty, yet something in my stomach tightened each time I watched them leave together, Emma laughing at something Marcus said as they walked to his car. I found the first receipt by accident while doing laundry, tucked in Marcus's jacket pocket, from a restaurant I'd never heard of. It was for 2 dinners, expensive ones with wine pairings, dated on a night he'd said he was at a client event. When I asked about it, he pulled up his calendar, showing me the client meeting scheduled that same evening. The client loved that place, he explained, always insisted on going there. He even showed me an email thanking the client for dinner, though something about how quickly he produced that evidence felt rehearsed, like he'd prepared for my question. Emma suddenly knew details about Marcus's work that surprised me. She'd mention his quarterly targets at dinner, ask how the meeting with a specific doctor went, reference pharmaceutical industry changes I hadn't heard about. When I commented on her newfound interest in prescription drugs, she laughed, saying she was trying to be supportive since he'd been so helpful with her job search. It made sense, but the looks they exchanged when discussing his work felt charged with something I couldn't name. The inside jokes started appearing like mushrooms after rain, private references that would make them both laugh while I stood there confused. Something about a lunch meeting that went wrong, a funny story from a traffic jam they'd been stuck in together, a shared observation about someone at Emma's firm I'd never met. When I'd ask for explanation, they'd try to include me, but the retellings always felt hollow, like the real humor existed in a space I couldn't access. Marcus's gift-giving toward Emma escalated from thoughtful to excessive. A designer purse appeared because he noticed hers was worn. Expensive perfume because the client gave him samples and he thought she'd like it. A laptop upgrade because her work would benefit from better technology. When I mentioned the cost, he'd remind me that Emma was family, that she'd lost everything in the divorce, that helping her rebuild was what family did. The words were right, but something in his tone suggested I was failing as a sister for questioning his generosity. Physical space between them began shrinking in ways that made me uncomfortable. They'd sit closer on the couch during movie nights, their thighs almost touching. Marcus's hand would linger on Emma's shoulder when he passed behind her chair. She'd fix his collar before work with an intimacy that felt too familiar. Once I walked into the kitchen to find them both at the coffee maker, standing so close they jumped apart when they heard me, then laughed awkwardly about how they'd both wanted coffee at the same time. My first real confrontation came after I discovered Marcus wasn't where he'd said he'd be. His conference was supposedly in Boulder, but when I called the hotel with a forgotten item question, they had no reservation under his name. When he came home, I asked how Boulder was, and he launched into detailed descriptions of sessions he'd attended, colleagues he'd met, the terrible conference food. Only when I mentioned calling the hotel did his face change. There'd been a last-minute venue switch, he said, pulling up an email about it. Why hadn't I just called his cell if I needed him? The question felt like an accusation, like I was the one who'd done something wrong. That night I told him something felt different between us, that I was worried about our marriage. Marcus's response was tender and devastating. He sat me down, held my hands, and told me he was worried too, but not about us, about me. The fertility struggles had taken a toll, he said, and now with my parents gone, and Emma's presence reminding me of family changes, I was projecting anxiety onto our solid relationship. He suggested I increase my therapy sessions, maybe consider medication for anxiety. When I insisted something was happening between him and Emma, his face crumpled like I'd slapped him. How could I think he'd betray me like that? With my own sister, maybe I needed more help than just therapy. Emma's reaction was worse. When I carefully brought up my concerns, she looked genuinely hurt. After everything Marcus had done for her, for us, how could I suspect him of something so horrible? Was I really so insecure that I couldn't handle her living with us? She started crying, saying she'd move out immediately if her presence was causing problems. Then she paused, looked at me with something like pity, and asked if I'd talked to my therapist about paranoid thoughts. Marcus had mentioned I'd been struggling lately and she wanted to be supportive, but maybe professional help was needed. My best friend Grace noticed changes in me during our monthly coffee dates. I'd lost weight, had dark circles under my eyes, jumped at notification sounds. When she asked what was wrong, I tried to explain my suspicions, but hearing them out loud made me sound delusional. My husband was being nice to my sister after her traumatic divorce, and I was spinning it into an affair. Grace listened carefully, then asked if I had any actual evidence beyond feelings. When I admitted I didn't, she gently suggested that grief and infertility could manifest in unexpected ways, that maybe Marcus was right about increasing therapy. The therapy sessions became a battlefield where I couldn't win. Dr. Patricia Mills was competent and kind, but when I described my concerns, she focused on my admitted anxiety, my grief, my fertility, trauma. She asked about my parents' marriage, whether I'd witnessed infidelity growing up, if I was projecting fears onto Marcus. When I insisted something real was happening, she'd redirect to my feelings rather than facts. How was my sleep? Was I eating properly? Had I considered that hypervigilance was a trauma response? Each session left me more confused, less trusting of my own perceptions. Marcus started coming to some sessions, presenting himself as the concerned, supportive husband. He'd detail his worries about my mood swings, my accusatory questions, my paranoid behavior. He mentioned finding me going through his phone while he slept, though I'd only done it once and found nothing. He told Dr. Mills about me following him to work, which wasn't true, though I had driven by his office once when he said he was there but his car wasn't. He painted a picture of a woman spiraling, and his tears seemed so genuine that even I started wondering if he was right. The gaslighting intensified with surgical precision, each interaction carefully crafted to destabilize my reality. Marcus developed a particular tone when addressing my concerns, patient and patronizing, like he was talking to a child having an irrational tantrum. He'd tilt his head, furrow his brow with concern, and speak slowly as if I might not understand normal speech. When I'd insist something was wrong, he'd sigh deeply and suggest we talk after I'd calmed down, after I'd had some rest, after my medication had time to work, though I wasn't taking any medication yet. Emma became his echo, reinforcing his narrative with her own observations about my behavior. She'd mentioned to Marcus loud enough for me to hear that I'd seemed confused that morning, that I'd repeated myself several times, that I'd forgotten conversations we'd supposedly had. When I'd protest that these things hadn't happened, she'd exchange worried looks with Marcus, their silent communication more damaging than any words. They'd developed a whole language of glances, raised eyebrows, and subtle nods that made me feel like a psychiatric patient being discussed by concerned caregivers. The jewelry incident broke something in me. My mother's emerald ring, which I kept in my bedside drawer, disappeared. I tore apart the bedroom looking for it, checking every possible place twice. 3 days later, I found Emma wearing it while cooking dinner. When I confronted her, shocked and angry, she looked genuinely confused. I'd given it to her the previous week, she said, told her mom would want her to have something beautiful after everything with Jake. Marcus backed her immediately, saying he'd witnessed the conversation, that I'd been emotional but clear about wanting Emma to have it. The look of concern he gave me, the gentle way he took my hand and suggested I lie down, made me feel insane. Marcus started telling our friends that I was struggling with depression and anxiety. At dinner parties, he'd apologetically explain my withdrawn behavior as a medical issue we were working through. He'd praise my strength while describing my challenges, earning sympathetic looks and supportive murmurs. People started treating me differently, speaking carefully, avoiding potentially triggering topics, asking Marcus how I was doing, rather than asking me directly. Our social circle, once my source of normalcy, became another stage for his performance of the devoted husband managing his troubled wife. The couples therapy sessions he scheduled became masterclasses in manipulation. He'd found Dr. Robert Chen, who specialized in couples dealing with mental health challenges. In sessions, Marcus would speak eloquently about his love for me, his desire to help, his frustration at not knowing how to reach me. He'd cry when describing how my accusations hurt him, how he felt like he was losing his wife to paranoid delusions. When I'd try to explain my perspective, Dr. Chen would redirect to my feelings rather than facts, asking why I felt threatened, what my fear was really about, whether I recognized how my behavior affected Marcus. Work became another battlefield. My concentration shattered from constantly questioning reality. I made mistakes I'd never made before. Medication errors that my supervising nurse caught before they reached patients. Charting inconsistencies that required corrections. My supervisor, Janet, called me in for a concerned conversation about my performance. She mentioned that Marcus had called her, worried about my mental state affecting my work. He hadn't wanted to betray my privacy, but patient safety came first. Janet suggested I take a mental health leave, get myself sorted out before returning to such a high-stakes environment. The doorbell camera I installed while they were both at work was my desperate attempt to prove I wasn't crazy. I told no one about it, paid cash at a store across town, installed it myself after watching online tutorials. The footage revealed patterns that vindicated my suspicions, but also showed how carefully they'd been managing appearances. Marcus and Emma would leave separately in the mornings, then meet up down the street. They'd return together, but Emma would wait in the car for 5 minutes before coming inside. Their body language when they thought they were unobserved was intimate, comfortable, familiar, in ways that transcended appropriate brother and sister-in-law dynamics. When I confronted them with specific times they'd been together when they'd said they were apart, Marcus's response was brilliantly devastating. He sat me down with Emma present, both of them radiating concern, and told me they'd been meeting with a psychiatrist about me. They'd been so worried, he explained, that they'd sought professional advice about how to help me. The meetings I'd discovered were appointments with this doctor, planning interventions, discussing treatment options. Emma pulled out business cards, appointment confirmations, even notes from their sessions. The paperwork looked real. Something in their eyes, a flicker of satisfaction at my confusion, told me it was all fabricated. Marcus threatened involuntary commitment with the skill of someone who'd researched the process thoroughly. He had documentation, he said, of my erratic behavior, my paranoid accusations, my deteriorating work performance. He'd consulted lawyers about his options as a concerned spouse. If I didn't voluntarily get help, he'd have no choice but to pursue formal psychiatric evaluation. The way he said it, tears in his eyes, voice breaking with supposed anguish, would have convinced anyone he was a desperate husband trying to save his wife from herself. My isolation became complete. Friends stopped responding to my texts as quickly, their replies careful and non-committal. Grace suggested I focus on getting better before we met again. Work granted me indefinite leave, strongly suggesting I not return until cleared by a psychiatrist. Even my online support group for fertility struggles suggested I might benefit from more intensive help than they could provide. Every avenue of normalcy, every connection to reality outside Marcus's narrative systematically closed off. The medication Marcus kept suggesting took on new significance when I started feeling worse after morning coffee. He'd bring it to me in bed, a gesture that once felt loving, but now felt like something else. The brain fog, the confusion, the moments where I'd lose time, they all followed the coffee. When I started skipping it, claiming nausea, he'd express concern, make tea instead, bring me water with vitamin supplements he said would help. Every drink he handed me became suspect, but refusing them led to more evidence of my paranoid behavior. Emma's legal knowledge revealed itself in subtle threats disguised as concern. She'd mentioned cases she'd studied where families had to make difficult decisions about impaired relatives. She'd described power of attorney processes, conservatorships, the legal standards for determining competency. All of this delivered with a worried sister's tone, holding my hand, telling me she just wanted me to understand my options, that they were there to protect me if I became unable to protect myself. The message was clear that they were building a legal case alongside the medical one. Physical symptoms I couldn't explain started manifesting. Tremors in my hands that Marcus documented with fake concern. Memory gaps that Emma would gently point out. Confusion about dates and times that they'd reference in front of others. Looking back, I realized these were likely effects of whatever they were putting in my drinks, but at the time, they felt like evidence that maybe I really was losing my mind. The doubt they planted grew like a cancer, metastasizing into every thought, every perception, every instinct I'd once trusted. One night I found myself standing in the kitchen at 3 a.m., unable to remember how I'd gotten there. Marcus found me, guided me back to bed with infinite patience, and I heard him tell Emma the next morning that I'd been sleepwalking again. I had no history of sleepwalking, but who could I tell? Who would believe me over the concerned husband documenting his wife's decline? That's when I realized I was running out of time, that whatever they were planning was accelerating, and if I didn't find proof soon, I'd disappear into whatever narrative they'd crafted. The decision to stop taking the sleeping pills Marcus had finally convinced me to try, prescribed by a doctor he'd found who specialized in anxiety and depression, saved my life. I'd palm them, pretend to swallow, then hide them in a tear in my mattress I'd created. The clarity that returned after 3 nights of real sleep felt like emerging from underwater. My hands steadied, my thoughts cleared, and for the first time in months I trusted my own perceptions. But I knew I had to maintain the performance of deterioration, had to let them think their plan was working while I gathered evidence of my own. The night that changed everything started like so many others, with Marcus insisting I take my sleeping medication while he watched. I'd perfected the illusion by then, holding the pill under my tongue, drinking water, even opening my mouth for his inspection while keeping it hidden. He'd kiss my forehead, tell me he loved me, that everything would be better soon, and I'd close my eyes pretending to drift off while the bitter pill dissolved under my tongue. Later, I'd carefully spit the remnants into tissues I'd flushed down the guest bathroom toilet. Around midnight, I heard movement downstairs, footsteps too careful to be innocent. Marcus's side of the bed was empty, which wasn't unusual since he'd claimed insomnia from worrying about me. But something about the quality of sound, two sets of feet trying to move quietly, made me slip out of bed. I'd learned to navigate our house silently during my sleepless nights of doubt, knowing which floorboards creaked, which doors needed lifting while opening to prevent squeaking. The staircase presented a challenge, but I discovered that staying close to the wall prevented most noise. I descended slowly, my heart hammering so hard I worried they'd hear it. Voices drifted from the kitchen, low and intimate, in a way that made my skin crawl. Through the slightly open door I could see them standing by the island, Emma in her silk pajamas that had appeared recently, Marcus in just his sleep pants, their bodies angled toward each other with the comfort of lovers. Marcus spoke first, his voice different than I'd heard it in months, lacking the careful concern he used with me. He sounded irritated, stressed in a way he never let me see anymore. His exact words burned into my memory like a brand, each syllable clear in the quiet house. "She's getting too suspicious. We need to speed up the timeline." The way he said it, matter-of-fact and cold, discussing my fate like a business transaction, made my legs nearly give out. Emma's response was equally casual, checking something on her phone as she spoke. "The insurance papers are ready. Once she signs, we can proceed." She showed him the screen, and they both nodded, satisfied with whatever documentation she'd prepared. The casualness of their conspiracy, the routine feeling of their discussions, suggested this wasn't their first late-night planning session, just the first I'd witnessed. What Marcus said next stopped my breathing entirely. The medication I've been putting in her coffee should make her deteriorate faster. He opened the cabinet where we kept vitamins and pulled out a prescription bottle I didn't recognize. He measured something into his palm, counting carefully. "Dr. Morrison says we can increase the dose without immediate danger, but we need to be careful. Too much at once and it'll show up in blood work if anyone orders tests." Emma moved closer to him, her hand sliding across his bare chest with practiced intimacy. "Are you sure the dose is safe? We can't have another accident like with your first wife." The words hit me like physical blows. First wife Marcus had told me I was his first everything, first serious girlfriend, first love, first and only wife. He'd claimed his lack of relationship experience before me, said I'd taught him how to love. His response was delivered with a chilling casualness that made my blood freeze. "Lisa's death was ruled accidental overdose. This will be depression-related, more believable given Diana's documented mental health struggles." The way he said my name, clinical and distant, like I was already gone, made me grip the wall to stay upright. He pulled Emma closer, kissing her temple with the same gesture he'd used with me thousands of times. Emma laughed, the sound soft and cruel simultaneously. I can't believe I ever felt guilty. She was always the golden child, the perfect one. Mom and Dad died before they could see her fail at the one thing that mattered to her, having children. At least they'll never know what we did to her. Then 8 months to a year later, successful suicide that no one would question. He'd play the grieving widower, Emma, the devastated sister, and they'd wait a respectable period before revealing their relationship. 2 years, Marcus said, and they'd be married with my money, funding their life together. The fertility clinic discussion revealed another layer of betrayal. Marcus had been sabotaging our treatments, Emma revealed, laughing about how he'd damaged samples before submission, ensuring they'd fail. He never wanted children with me, just needed me to believe we were trying. The devastation of those failures, the grief I'd carried, the sense of being broken and unable to give him what he wanted, it had all been orchestrated. Every tear I'd shed, every apology I'd made for my faulty body, had been part of their plan. Emma mentioned her gambling debts, then $300,000 that Jake didn't even know about accumulated during their marriage at underground poker games. She'd been desperate when she contacted Marcus 2 years ago, before I even knew she was in trouble. He'd offered a solution that would solve both their problems. He'd get my money and freedom from a marriage he'd entered for financial gain, she'd get her debts cleared and a wealthy partner. My destruction was just collateral damage in their mutual benefit arrangement. They discussed Marcus's first wife, Lisa, then, and I learned the full horror of who I'd married. Lisa had been wealthy too, an heiress to a pharmaceutical fortune, which is how Marcus had entered that industry. He'd married her quickly, isolated her from family, then slowly poisoned her with medications that mimicked mental illness. Her death was ruled accidental mixing prescriptions in a confused state. Her family suspected him, but couldn't prove anything, and he'd inherited everything. He'd used Lisa's money to build the sophisticated persona that had attracted me. The discussion of my replacement was perhaps the most chilling. Emma pulled up dating apps on her phone showing Marcus profiles of women who looked like me but younger, more vulnerable. They were already planning his next victim after me discussing which sob story would work best. Widower destroyed by successive tragedies, needing someone to heal his broken heart. Emma would play the supportive sister-in-law vouching for his character. They'd run the same con again once they'd depleted my resources. I recorded everything on my phone, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it several times. The video was dark, but the audio was clear, their voices distinct and damning. They talked for another hour, reviewing documents Emma had prepared, discussing the psychiatrist Marcus had paid to provide false evaluations, the nurse at the facility they'd chosen, who would ensure I never improved. They kissed deeply before returning to their separate beds, and I waited a full 30 minutes before creeping back to mine. The next morning, I initiated my performance of perfect deterioration while secretly beginning my investigation. I acted confused at breakfast, asking Marcus the same question twice, seeming to forget Emma's name momentarily. They exchanged those satisfied looks they thought I didn't catch, and Marcus gently suggested I rest while he made my coffee. I watched him add 2 pills to my cup from the unmarked bottle, stirring carefully until they dissolved. When he turned away, I poured it into a potted plant that had been dying for weeks, then quickly poured fresh coffee and pretended to sip. My first call was to a private investigator recommended in an online forum for domestic abuse survivors. I used a burner phone purchased with cash at a convenience store 2 towns over, hiding it inside an old tampon box in my bathroom. Thomas Anderson was a former detective who specialized in cases involving suspected poisoning and psychiatric abuse. His voice was kind but professional when I explained my situation, and he agreed to meet me at a library 3 towns away where Marcus wouldn't think to look. Thomas's investigation uncovered a nightmare that exceeded even what I'd overheard. Lisa Matthews. Marcus's first wife had died just 18 months before he met me. Her family had hired investigators, but hit dead ends. Marcus had been careful, but not perfect. Thomas found evidence of Marcus researching specific drug interactions months before Lisa's death, searches about inheritance law, psychiatric commitment procedures. He'd visited forums about untraceable poisons, though he'd tried to delete the history. Digital forensics revealed the ghost of his preparations. Lisa's mother, Catherine, was desperate to speak with me when Thomas made contact. Our phone conversation lasted 3 hours, both of us crying as we pieced together the parallel patterns. The gaslighting, the mysterious illness, the psychiatric threats. Even the same psychiatrist, Dr. Morrison, who'd provided false documentation. Lisa had tried to leave, but Marcus had her committed for 72 hours, during which she'd had a fatal accident. Catherine had documentation she'd gathered, including Lisa's journal entries describing experiences identical to mine. Emma's background check revealed financial crimes dating back to college. She'd embezzled from her first law firm but avoided prosecution by agreeing to leave quietly. The gambling debts were worse than she'd admitted, closer to $500,000, with connections to dangerous people who'd threatened her life. Her marriage to Jake had been a cover, someone to hide behind while she figured out her next move. She'd been in contact with Marcus for 3 years, not 2, their affair beginning long before her divorce. Thomas helped me document everything safely. We photographed the pills Marcus was giving me, had them analyzed at a private lab. They contained a cocktail of psychiatric medications, including haloperidol, lorazepam, and lithium, in dangerous combinations that would cause exactly the symptoms Marcus was documenting. Long-term use would cause permanent damage, possibly death. The lab technician was horrified, said whoever prescribed this combination was either incompetent or murderous. I discovered the secret bank account Marcus and Emma had opened using my forged signature. They'd been slowly transferring money, small enough amounts to avoid detection, but totaling nearly $200,000 over 6 months. Emma had used her position at the law firm to create shell companies' false documentation, an entire paper trail that would make recovering the money nearly impossible once I was gone or incapacitated. The forged documents were extensive. Power of attorney papers, DNR orders, psychiatric advance directives, saying I wanted no visitors if hospitalized, consent forms for experimental treatments. Emma had even created a fake suicide note in my handwriting, practicing my signature hundreds of times on papers I found hidden in her room. The note blamed my infertility, my parents' death, my mental illness, absolving Marcus and Emma of any responsibility. My medical records had been altered through Dr. Morrison, who Thomas discovered wasn't a real psychiatrist, but a disgraced former doctor who'd lost his license for insurance fraud. Marcus was paying him $50,000 to provide false documentation. The records showed a progressive mental illness. I didn't have complete with fabricated therapy notes, medication prescriptions, even commitment recommendations waiting to be dated and filed. Thomas connected me with Detective Sarah Coleman, who'd been investigating Dr. Morrison for other crimes. When she saw my evidence, she immediately opened investigations into both Marcus and Lisa's death. She had me continue my performance while wearing a wire gathering more evidence. The FBI got involved when they discovered the fertility clinic embryo trafficking plan, which connected to a larger network Marcus was part of. Emma's research history, recovered from her laptop by Thomas's tech expert, was a timeline of premeditated murder, searches about undetectable poisons, inheritance law, psychiatric commitment standards, how long before remarriage after spouse's death. She'd bookmarked articles about Black Widow killers, taking notes about their mistakes. She'd even joined online forums for grieving widows, studying how to perform grief convincingly. The hardest part was maintaining my act while building my case. I had to let them think they were winning, had to appear increasingly unstable, while secretly being sharper than ever. I documented everything: recorded conversations, photographed evidence. Thomas taught me how to hide cameras, transfer files to secure clouds, protect myself while gathering what we needed. Every day felt like walking through a minefield, one wrong step away from disappearing into their plan. Catherine provided crucial evidence about Marcus's first attempt. She had security footage from Lisa's apartment building showing Marcus entering with medical supplies he claimed were vitamins, phone records showing his calls to Dr. Morrison before Lisa's diagnosis, bank records revealing large cash withdrawals before Lisa's death. Lisa's friend had secretly recorded a conversation where Lisa expressed fear of Marcus, saying he was poisoning her, though everyone had dismissed it as paranoia. My own investigation revealed the depth of their physical relationship. Hotel receipts going back 2 years charged to Marcus's business card, but for days he was supposedly traveling alone. Jewelry purchases for Emma that matched pieces she wore. Plane tickets for vacations they'd taken, while I thought Marcus was at conferences, and Emma was visiting college friends. Photos on Emma's cloud showing them together at restaurants, on beaches, in bed, dating back to when she was still married to Jake. The final piece came from an unexpected source. Jake, Emma's ex-husband, reached out after Thomas contacted him. He had suspected Emma was having an affair, but thought it was with her boss. He had hired his own investigator who had photos of Emma and Marcus together, which he'd kept as insurance in the divorce. He also had recordings of Emma discussing her debts, her desperation, her willingness to do anything to solve her problems. He'd been afraid of her by the end, said she'd threatened him when he tried to leave. By the time I had everything documented, the case was ironclad. Attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, embezzlement, poisoning, and connecting to Lisa's murder. But I needed them to feel secure enough to make a final mistake, to say something definitive while being recorded by law enforcement. Detective Coleman and I planned the dinner party, carefully choosing guests who would serve as witnesses while keeping Marcus and Emma unaware of the trap closing around them. The dinner party was scheduled for a Saturday evening 3 weeks after I'd started working with law enforcement. I presented it to Marcus and Emma as my attempt to prove I was getting better, wanting to reconnect with friends, show everyone I was stabilizing. Marcus was thrilled, seeing it as evidence his medications were working. Emma offered to help cook, playing the supportive sister perfectly. Neither suspected that Detective Coleman had contacted each guest, briefing them on their role as witnesses. I invited carefully chosen people, including Marcus's boss, Richard Harrison, someone he'd never risk appearing unstable in front of. 3 couples from our social circle who'd been concerned about me, including Grace and her husband. 2 of Marcus's pharmaceutical colleagues, who'd known Lisa, though Marcus didn't know they'd been questioned by police about her death. Emma's colleague from the law firm, who'd secretly reported suspicious documents Emma had been creating. Each guest had been told to act normally, to follow my lead, but to pay attention to everything. The week before the party, I gradually improved my performance, acting like the medications were helping but still fragile. I let Marcus see me taking pills, thanked him for his patience, even apologized for my paranoid accusations. I told Emma I was grateful for her support, that I didn't know what I'd have done without her. They believed their victory was near, and their guard dropped incrementally. They held hands when they thought I wasn't looking, shared celebratory glances over my supposed improvement. On the party night, I dressed carefully in the blue dress Marcus had bought me for our anniversary, styled my hair how he preferred, applied makeup to hide the exhaustion of living in constant fear. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone who could pass for recovering, stable enough to host but still fragile. Marcus kissed me when he saw me, told me I looked beautiful, that he was proud of my progress. The kiss made my skin crawl, but I smiled and thanked him for never giving up on me. Guests arrived at 7 and I played the gracious hostess while wearing a wire under my dress. Detective Coleman and her team were in a van outside recording everything. The FBI agents were positioned at exits in case Marcus or Emma tried to run. I served drinks, laughed at appropriate moments, engaged in small talk about work and weather while my heart raced. Marcus stayed close, his hand on my back, the protective husband monitoring his fragile wife. Dinner conversation flowed normally until Richard mentioned the company's concern about Marcus's recent performance, his distraction and missed meetings. Marcus smoothly explained he'd been caring for me, that my mental health crisis had required his attention. Richard's response was perfectly timed, saying he understood family came first, but hoping things would stabilize soon. Marcus assured him they would, that solutions were being implemented, and Emma nodded supportively beside him. After dinner, while serving dessert, I set my plan in motion. I stood tapping my wine glass for attention, thanking everyone for coming, for their patience during my difficult time. Then I announced that I'd been accepted to an advanced nursing program in New York, that I'd be starting next month, that this was partly a goodbye dinner. The shock on Marcus and Emma's faces was immediately replaced by careful concern as Marcus stood putting his arm around me. Marcus's performance was flawless, as he expressed worry about my decision, suggesting we discuss it privately, that such a big change might be too stressful in my current state. His voice carried just the right amount of loving concern mixed with gentle condescension. He looked at our guests apologetically, the husband trying to protect his unwell wife from her own poor judgment. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. That's when I produced the folder from behind the dessert tray. Inside were copies of my clean blood work from an independent lab, proving I had no psychiatric medications in my system. The psychological evaluation from a court-appointed psychiatrist stating I showed no signs of mental illness, bank records showing the fraudulent transfers, photos of the unmarked medication bottles. Marcus tried to grab the folder, but I stepped back, continuing to hand out copies to each guest. Emma stood abruptly, claiming she felt sick, needed air, but Grace's husband blocked her path on Detective Coleman's earlier instruction. Emma's face went white as she realized something was wrong. Marcus tried to maintain control, saying these documents were further evidence of my paranoid delusions, that I'd clearly stopped taking my medications and was having an episode. He appealed to Richard, to our friends, asking them to help him get me the care I needed. I pulled out my phone and played the recording from that night in the kitchen. Marcus's voice filled the room, discussing increasing my medication dose, mentioning Lisa's death, planning my commitment and eventual murder. Emma's voice followed, talking about insurance papers, forged documents, their timeline for my destruction. The room went absolutely silent, except for the recorded voices discussing my planned demise with casual cruelty. Richard was the first to speak, his face pale with shock and rage. He pulled out his phone, calling security to have Marcus's access revoked immediately, his company property returned. He looked at Marcus with disgust, saying he'd personally ensure Marcus never worked in pharmaceuticals again. The professional destruction was swift and complete, but Marcus was still focused on the immediate threat, his eyes darting between exits. Emma tried to claim the recordings were fake, edited, taken out of context. She used her legal training to throw doubt, saying recordings could be manipulated, that I'd clearly orchestrated this out of jealousy. But then I produced Jake's evidence, the photos of her and Marcus from 2 years ago, the recordings of her discussing her debts and desperation. Her own ex-husband's evidence destroyed her attempted defense. The doorbell rang then, and Marcus's face changed as he realized what was happening. Detective Coleman entered with 4 uniformed officers and 2 FBI agents. She announced they were under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, and multiple other charges. Marcus tried to run, heading for the back door, but found an agent waiting. Emma collapsed into a chair, sobbing, trying to claim Marcus had manipulated her, that she was a victim too. As they were handcuffed, Detective Coleman revealed they'd been investigating Lisa's death for months, that my evidence had broken the case open. Marcus would be charged with Lisa's murder, along with attempting mine. Dr. Morrison had already been arrested and was cooperating fully, providing evidence about Marcus's careful planning. The fertility clinic fraud had exposed a larger network that the FBI was dismantling. Emma's arrest was particularly satisfying, as she realized I'd known everything while pretending to deteriorate. The dawning comprehension that I'd played her while she thought she was playing me broke her composure completely. She screamed that I'd always been the favorite, that I'd stolen everything from her, that she deserved what I had. The guests watched in horror as the sister they'd known revealed her true self. Marcus maintained his silence as they led him away, but his eyes met mine one last time. In them I saw not remorse but rage at being outsmarted. He'd thought me weak, broken by grief and infertility, easy to destroy. The realization that I'd been stronger than him, smart enough to uncover his crimes, and brave enough to fight back, that was what finally broke his carefully maintained mask. Detective Coleman stayed after they were gone, explaining to the shocked guests what would happen next. They'd need statements from everyone, but the evidence was overwhelming. She praised my courage in gathering evidence while in danger, said I'd potentially saved future victims. Catherine, Lisa's mother, had been notified and was already flying in to attend the trial. Justice for Lisa would finally be served. The first weeks in New York felt like learning to breathe again after nearly drowning. I'd found a small apartment in Queens, far from the gleaming Manhattan towers, but perfect for rebuilding a life from scratch. The nursing program at Columbia was demanding enough to occupy my mind during days when memories threatened to overwhelm me. At night, though, the silence reminded me how close I'd come to disappearing into Marcus and Emma's manufactured narrative. Therapy this time was different because Dr. Sarah Chen actually listened when I spoke. She specialized in survivors of intimate partner abuse, particularly cases involving gaslighting and psychological manipulation. Our sessions focused not on whether my perceptions were accurate, but on rebuilding my ability to trust them. She helped me understand that Marcus had chosen me specifically because of my trusting nature, my recent losses, my vulnerability after fertility struggles. I wasn't weak for being targeted, I was simply human. The support group for domestic abuse survivors met in a church basement on Tuesday evenings. At first I couldn't speak, just listened to other women share stories that echoed mine in different keys. The woman whose husband convinced her she had early onset dementia. The one whose boyfriend had her believing she was violent during blackouts she couldn't remember. Each story reinforced that predators like Marcus followed patterns, that systematic destruction of reality was a documented form of abuse. Catherine flew in from Seattle every few weeks as the trial approached. We'd meet for coffee, sharing stories about the people we'd thought we'd married, the men who'd destroyed the women we'd loved. She brought Lisa's journals, and reading them felt like looking in a mirror across time. Lisa had written about the same confusion, the same self-doubt, the same gradual realization that love shouldn't feel like losing your mind. Catherine became a second mother to me, and I became the daughter she'd nearly lost twice. The trial dominated 6 months of my life. Testifying meant reliving every moment, every manipulation, every dose of poison hidden in morning coffee. Marcus's defense attorney tried to paint me as a scorned wife creating elaborate fiction, but the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings, the forged documents, the testimony from Dr. Morrison, who'd made a deal for reduced sentence. When the prosecutor played the recording of Marcus discussing Lisa's murder, several jurors cried. Marcus was convicted on all charges including first-degree murder for Lisa, attempted murder for me, fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering related to the fertility clinic scheme. The judge sentenced him to life without parole, calling him a predator who'd weaponized love and trust. When the verdict was read, Marcus stared at me with the same cold calculation he'd hidden throughout our marriage. There was no remorse, only anger at being caught. Emma's trial was separate but equally damaging. Her attempts to claim Marcus had manipulated her fell apart under cross-examination. The prosecution presented her research history, her forged documents, her willing participation in planning my death. She was sentenced to 15 years for conspiracy, attempted murder, fraud, and embezzlement. At sentencing, she cried and apologized, but I recognized the performance. She was sorry she'd been caught, not sorry for what she'd done. The civil suits took another year but recovered most of what they'd stolen plus damages. I donated half to a foundation Catherine and I established in Lisa's name, providing legal and investigative resources for people suspecting intimate partner poisoning. The other half funded my new life, though no amount of money could restore the innocence I'd lost the ability to trust without question the sister I'd thought I'd had. I returned to nursing with a different focus, specializing in psychiatric care. My experience gave me unique insight into how mental health systems could be weaponized against victims. I developed protocols for identifying potential abuse victims, admitted for psychiatric symptoms, looking for patterns others might miss. The hospital created a position for me training staff to recognize medical gaslighting and covert poisoning. Dating remained unthinkable for the first 2 years. The thought of letting someone close enough to hurt me again made my chest tight with panic. But slowly through therapy and time, I learned to differentiate between reasonable caution and trauma response. I went on coffee dates that led nowhere, had brief relationships that ended naturally, learned to trust my instincts about people again. When red flags appeared, I honored them instead of explaining them away. 3 years after the trial, I decided to pursue single motherhood. The fertility clinic Marcus had sabotaged was shut down, but I found a reputable one that understood my history. The process was different alone, simultaneously harder and easier. No one was secretly destroying my chances, but also no one held my hand during procedures. When the first IVF cycle succeeded, I cried for hours. Grief and joy tangled together inextricably. My daughter was born on a snowy January morning, and I named her Catherine Lisa, honoring the women who'd suffered Marcus's evil. She had my eyes, but her own fierce spirit apparent from her first angry cry. Holding her, I thought about the children Marcus had prevented me from having, the family he'd sabotaged while pretending to grieve with me. But mostly I felt grateful that she'd never know him, never be touched by his poison. Catherine, the original one, became grandmother to my Catherine in every way that mattered. She moved to New York when the baby was 6 months old, buying an apartment 2 blocks away. We raised little Catherine together, surrounded her with the kind of honest love neither of us had experienced in our marriages. When she was old enough to ask about her father, I told her the truth in age-appropriate pieces. Some people choose donors, I explained, and that was perfect for our family. The nightmares faded gradually but never disappeared entirely. Sometimes I'd wake thinking I heard whispers in the kitchen, or dream about coffee that tasted wrong. But these moments became less frequent, less powerful. I learned to ground myself in present reality, to list facts that proved I was safe. My daughter sleeping peacefully, my work badge on the dresser, the city sounds outside my window, all evidence of the life I'd built from the ashes. 5 years after everything, I was asked to speak at a conference about medical gaslighting and intimate partner abuse. Standing at that podium looking at hundreds of healthcare workers, I thought about the woman who doubted her own perceptions, who'd nearly disappeared into someone else's narrative. That woman had saved herself through instinct and courage she didn't know she possessed. Now I could help others save themselves too. The conference speech led to consulting work training law enforcement and medical professionals to recognize signs others might miss. I developed screening tools that became standard in emergency departments, questions that might reveal when someone's mental health crisis was manufactured. Every person saved every victim who escaped before it was too late, felt like both Lisa and I surviving again. Marcus died in prison 7 years into his sentence. A heart attack, the report said, though rumors suggested other inmates had their own justice for men who poisoned women. I felt nothing when I heard neither joy nor grief, just a quiet closing of a chapter. Emma was released after 12 years, her sentence reduced for good behavior. She sent one letter apologizing again, asking for forgiveness. I burned it unread. My daughter grew into a confident, intuitive young woman who trusted her instincts implicitly because I taught her to honor them from birth. She knew the story of how she came to be understood, that families could be built from choice and love rather than traditional structures. When she was 16, she asked to read the trial transcripts. I let her, then held her while she cried for the mother she'd almost lost before she existed. 20 years have passed since that night in the kitchen, when I heard the whispers that saved my life. I'm 54 now, with silver threading through my hair and laugh lines earned through real joy. My daughter just started medical school, determined to become the kind of doctor who listens when patients say something's wrong. Catherine passed last year at 91, peaceful in her sleep, having lived to see justice served and love rebuilt. Sometimes I speak at survivor support groups, sharing my story with women who recognize themselves in it. I tell them about the whispers I heard, but more importantly about the whispers I'd ignored from my own intuition for months before that night. The body knows when it's being poisoned, the mind recognizes patterns even when we consciously deny them, the spirit rebels against systematic destruction even when gaslighted into submission. The most important lesson I share is this: your paranoia might be pattern recognition. Your anxiety might be appropriate response to danger. Your gut feelings aren't symptoms of mental illness, but survival instincts evolved over millennia. When someone tells you you're crazy for noticing reality, they're often the one creating false narrative. Trust yourself especially when someone you love is teaching you not to. I think about Lisa often, the woman I never met but who saved me from beyond the grave. Her journals, her mother's persistence, her story that proved Marcus's patterns, all of it contributed to my survival. We're connected across time and death by the man who tried to destroy us both. But we're also connected by our refusal to disappear quietly, our insistence on being believed even when the world called us paranoid. My life now is quiet and full, built on foundation of hard-won wisdom and careful trust. I have friends who've earned their place through years of consistent kindness. I have work that matters, using my worst experience to prevent others from enduring the same. I have my daughter, my greatest joy and proof that beautiful things can grow from poisoned ground. I have myself, complete and whole, no longer questioning my perceptions, but honoring them as the gift they've always been. The whispers I heard that night saved my life, but the whispers I'd ignored from my own intuition nearly cost it. Your gut feeling isn't paranoia, it's your survival instinct. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. Trust yourself fiercely, love yourself completely, and never apologize for recognizing danger even when it comes wrapped in affection. Sometimes the person who claims to love you most is the one carefully measuring poison for your morning coffee. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever been told you're too sensitive, too paranoid, too anxious about things that feel wrong, then you're not alone. Comment below if this resonated with you. Share this with someone who might need to hear it. Like and subscribe if you believe in supporting survivors and spreading awareness. Together, we can help others recognize the whispers before it's too late. Remember, you're stronger than you know, and your instincts are there to protect you. Trust them always.